He was a man who had built walls around his heart, stone by silent stone. She was a woman who sought shelter from a storm she had not created, a tempest of lies that had stolen her name and her home. On the vast, lonely expanse of the Montana frontier, their paths were destined to cross, not by chance, but by the quiet pull of two souls learning to heal. This is a story about the job no one wanted, the broken man who offered it, and the resilient woman who took it, only to find that in the heart of solitude, love could finally be rebuilt from the ruins of the past. We love to hear from our listeners, so please let us know where in the world you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories that touch the heart and inspire the spirit, be sure to subscribe to our channel for another special story we have waiting for you next week. Now, settle in, as we begin our tale. The dust of hope's crossing tasted of endings. Elara Vance felt it on her tongue, a gritty film that coated the back of her throat. It was the taste of her last dollar, of the last frayed thread of her reputation. The town was little more than a single muddy street carved from the wilderness, a place people passed through on their way to somewhere better. For Elara, there was nowhere else to go. Her gaze fell upon a notice tacked to the general store's bulletin board, its corners curled and yellowed by the relentless sun. Housekeeper wanted. Thorn Ranch. Room and board provided. Inquire at the property. The words were simple, stark. But it was the whisper she overheard from two women nearby that gave them weight. Thorn's place? Poor girl who takes that job heard he hasn't spoken a full sentence in 5 years. Not since the fire, a brute of a man. Lives out there with ghosts. The whispers were meant to be a warning, but to Elara, they sounded like a sanctuary. A silent man. A remote ranch. A place where the past could not so easily find her? She asked for directions, and the store owner simply pointed a gnarled finger toward the jagged peaks that tore at the western sky. Just follow the road till you feel like you're the last soul on earth, he'd grunted. Then keep going, and so she walked. The sun beat down upon her worn bonnet, and the landscape stretched out, vast and unforgiving. Yet, in its raw, untamed beauty, Elara found a strange comfort. The stubborn wildflowers that pushed their way through the rocky soil were a reflection of the hope she still carried, a fragile bloom in the barren ground of her life. She was a survivor, not a victim, and she would prove it, even to a man who lived with ghosts. The Thorn Ranch emerged from the landscape not as a beacon, but as a scar. The long, winding path ended at a property that was immense in its scope but hollow in its spirit. A great, skeletal frame of a barn stood half-finished, its fresh-cut timber a stark contrast to the weathered grey of the main house. The house itself was grand, a 2-story structure built for a family, but its windows were like vacant eyes, staring out at nothing. A deep, unnerving quiet hung over the entire property, a silence that felt heavier than the absence of sound. Elara's heart beat a steady, determined rhythm against her ribs as she approached the porch. Before her hand could reach the door, it swung inward. He stood there, filling the frame, a silhouette against the dim interior. The whispers had not done him justice. Caleb Thorne was more than a large man, he was a mountain, solid and immovable. His shoulders were broad enough to carry the weight of the world, and it looked as though he had tried. A faded scar, pale as a wisp of smoke, cut a thin line from his temple into his dark, unkempt hair. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held no welcome, only a deep, weary stillness. He did not speak. He simply watched her, his gaze taking in her dusty dress, the exhaustion etched onto her face, and the unwavering set of her jaw. Elara found her voice, though it felt small in the oppressive silence. "I've come about the housekeeper position." His gaze lingered for a moment longer, a silent assessment that went deeper than words. Then, he gave a curt nod and stepped aside. His voice, when it finally came, was a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. "The work is hard." He paused, his eyes sweeping over the dusty, empty hall. "The quiet is harder." He did not ask for references. He did not ask where she was from or why a woman like her was alone and seeking such a remote post. It was as if he saw the answer in her very posture. She was running from something, and his fortress of solitude was the perfect hiding place. He saw the desperation, but he also saw the resilience coiled beneath it. "The pay is $30 a month, plus room and board," he stated, his tone flat, a simple declaration of fact. "You start now with that." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway of her new life, the heavy silence of the house closing in around her. The days at the Thorn Ranch fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons, a silent cadence of work and solitude. Elara rose before dawn, the chill of the house a constant companion, and set about banishing the dust of neglect. She scrubbed floors until the wood grain shone with a forgotten luster, polished windows until the lonely landscape outside seemed a little brighter, and coaxed the great iron stove in the kitchen back to life. The kitchen became her domain, a pocket of warmth and purpose in the vast, echoing house. Caleb was a ghost within his own home. He would be gone before she lit the first lamp and would return long after the sun had bled from the sky, taking his meals from the plate she left warming on the stove. They moved around each other in a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance, their paths rarely crossing. Yet, a language began to form between them, one spoken not with words, but with actions. After a week of her scrubbing laundry by hand at the well, a new washboard and a bar of lye soap appeared on the back porch. When she mentioned to the empty air of the kitchen that the pantry was low on flour, a new 50-pound sack was waiting by the door the next morning. In return, she began leaving a thermos of hot coffee on the porch railing before sunrise and ensured a hearty, warm meal was always ready, no matter how late he returned. One afternoon, while airing out dusty linens, she discovered a small, overgrown patch of earth behind the house, choked with weeds but protected by a low stone wall. It had once been a garden. An idea took root in her mind. With a rusty spade she found in a shed, she began the arduous task of turning the soil, pulling the stubborn weeds, and clearing the stones. It was back-breaking work, but it was hers. From the far side of the property, where he toiled on the skeleton of the barn, Caleb watched her. He saw her small figure bent over the earth, her determination a silent rebuke to the neglect that had claimed his land, and his life. A flicker of something long dormant stirred within his chest. Her presence was a disturbance, a quiet disruption to the careful emptiness he had cultivated. But as he watched her coaxing life from the dead soil, he found it was not an unwelcome one. It was the faintest whisper of a song in a house that had been silent for far too long. A storm rolled in from the mountains one night, not with a gentle warning, but with a sudden, violent fury. The wind howled like a grieving animal, and rain lashed against the window panes. Elara was jolted from a light sleep by a clap of thunder so sharp and deep it sounded like a splintering door, like the crack of a gavel sealing a terrible fate. The sound plunged her back into a memory she fought daily to suppress, the echoing slam of an auctioneer's hammer, the final, shattering blow that had declared her family ruined. She rose, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm, and made her way to the kitchen, seeking the comfort of its familiar space. She stood by the window, wrapping her arms around herself, watching as lightning tore jagged wounds across the bruised purple sky. She didn't hear him approach. One moment she was alone, the next Caleb was there, a solid presence in the flickering darkness. He said nothing, but his nearness was a question. He saw the stark pallor of her face, the tremor in her hands. He moved to the stove, his motions deliberate and calm, and stoked the embers back to life. He prepared 2 mugs of tea, the clink of the ceramic a small, reassuring sound against the storm's rage. He handed one to her, his calloused fingers brushing hers for a fleeting instant. It was the first time they had touched. They sat at the heavy wooden table, the storm raging outside, a quiet truce existing between them in the small circle of lamplight. It was a simple act, this shared vigil, but it was more intimate than any conversation they might have had. The silence was no longer empty, it was filled with a shared understanding of fear, of the storms that rage both outside and within. Later that week, driven by a need to bring order to every corner of the house, Elara ventured into Caleb's study, a room he never used. It was coated in a thick layer of dust, a time capsule of his grief. While carefully dusting a bookshelf, her fingers brushed against a small, leather-bound frame, face down. Curiosity warred with her sense of propriety, and curiosity won. She turned it over. The photograph was of a woman with a warm, gentle smile and a little girl with Caleb's stormy eyes, her face alight with laughter. The edge of the photograph was singed, a dark, creeping char that told its own terrible story. A profound, aching sadness washed over Elara. She now understood. His silence wasn't born of cruelty or anger. It was a tombstone, erected in memory of a life that had been turned to ash. The arrival of the carriage was an intrusion of a world that did not belong on the Thorn Ranch. It was too sleek, too polished, its lacquered black panels gleaming with an obscene brightness under the harsh Montana sun. The man who stepped out was cut from the same cloth. Sterling Blackwood was handsome in a predatory way, his tailored suit a stark insult to the rugged landscape. His smile was a carefully crafted thing, a mask of charm that did not touch the cold calculation in his eyes. He saw Elara by the garden, her hands covered in dirt, and his smile widened. "Elara," he called out, his voice smooth and proprietary. "I must admit, I never pictured you for such a rustic life. But the game is over. I've come to collect what you owe." Elara felt the blood drain from her face. This was the man who haunted her waking moments, the architect of her ruin. She straightened her spine, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "I owe you nothing, Sterling," she said, her voice low but steady. "You know perfectly well what you did." He chuckled, a condescending sound that scraped at her nerves. "My dear, sentiment won't change the facts. You were an accomplice to your father's thievery. The law is on my side. I'm here to offer you a choice: return what was stolen, or I will see you put in a place where you can no longer tarnish your family's good name." It was then that Caleb appeared. He moved with the silent tread she had come to know, materializing at the edge of the porch like a protective spirit of the land. He did not speak, simply stood there, his immense frame blocking the path to the house, his stormy eyes fixed on Blackwood. His presence was a silent, unshakable declaration. Blackwood's charming facade faltered for a moment. He tried to regain his footing, turning his oily smile on Caleb. "Sir, this is a private matter. This woman is a fugitive, a thief who absconded with a considerable sum of my family's money." Caleb's gaze shifted from Blackwood to Elara, and in that brief, silent exchange, a question was asked and an answer was given. He turned his attention back to the intruder, his voice the rumble of distant thunder. "She is under my protection." The words were simple, but they were forged from iron. Leave. Blackwood's face hardened, the mask slipping to reveal the ugliness beneath. "You'll regret this, rancher. I will be back. And I will bring the law with me." The dust from Sterling Blackwood's departing carriage settled, but the peace of the ranch had been shattered. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with the residue of a threat that now hung over them like a hawk circling its prey. That evening, the silence at the dinner table was no longer comfortable, it was tense and heavy. Elara knew she could not let it stand. Caleb had placed himself between her and her past without question, and he deserved the truth. Pushing her plate away, she finally spoke into the quiet, her voice clear and resolved. "My father was a good man," she began, her eyes fixed on the worn grain of the table. "He was a watchmaker, an artist." Sterling Blackwood's father was his partner. When the old man died, Sterling took over. He had grand ideas, ambitions that outstripped his sense of honor. She recounted the story in a flat, emotionless tone, as if speaking of someone else. She told him how Blackwood had used their company's funds for his own reckless ventures, how he'd forged her father's signature on loans, and how, when it all collapsed, he'd masterfully shifted the blame. "He ruined my father. The accusations, the scandal, it broke his heart. He died within the year." Her voice trembled for the first time. "After the funeral, Sterling came to me. He said he could make it all go away, that he could restore my name, if I would be his wife. When I refused, he spread the rumor that I had been his accomplice, that I had fled with stolen money. I had to leave." When she finished, the only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock. She finally dared to look at Caleb. He was watching her, his expression unreadable but for the intensity in his gaze. He had listened to her entire story without a single interruption. His next words were quiet, but they landed in her soul like a foundation stone. "I believe you." The simple affirmation was everything. Then, as if her confession had unlocked a door within him, he spoke of his own tragedy. His voice was rough, halting, as he described the life he'd once had. The wife he'd adored. The daughter who was his sun and moon. He told her about the trip he'd taken to buy cattle, a trip that was supposed to last 2 days. There was a storm, he said, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze lost in the past. Lightning. The barn went up first. The wind carried the flames to the house. I was miles away. By the time I got back, he didn't need to finish. The singed photograph, the half-built barn, the crushing silence of his life, it all coalesced into a single, heartbreaking truth. He was rebuilding the barn not just with wood and nails, but with guilt and atonement. In that moment, seated at the kitchen table, 2 broken souls laid their scars bare, and in the shared space of their pain, a bond of trust was forged, stronger than steel. True to his word, Sterling Blackwood returned 2 days later. He was not alone. Beside him sat a portly, sour-faced man with a tarnished badge pinned to his vest, Sheriff Miller, a man whose loyalty was known to be as flexible as the money offered for it. They rode right up to the porch, dismounting with an air of smug authority. The sheriff brandished a piece of paper. "Caleb Thorne," he announced, his voice puffed with self-importance. "I have a warrant for the arrest of one Elara Vance, for charges of theft and fraud, filed in the county of her origin." Caleb met them at the door before they could even set foot on his porch. He didn't stand in the doorway this time, he stood on the porch itself, a deliberate step forward, claiming the ground as his own. Behind him, in the doorway, stood Elara. Her heart was hammering, but she held her head high. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was tempered by a new, unfamiliar strength drawn from the man standing before her. "Let me see that warrant, Sheriff," Caleb said, his voice calm and even. The sheriff, surprised by the lack of immediate hostility, handed it over. Caleb read it slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was not just a brute, he was intelligent, and his mind was now a weapon. "This warrant seems to be missing the signature of a circuit judge," he noted, his tone mild. "Just a local magistrate's stamp. And it lists no specific articles or sums, just a vague accusation. Seems flimsy for taking a person into custody across county lines," the sheriff sputtered, taken aback. "Now see here, Thorne, this is official business." Blackwood stepped forward, his patience wearing thin. "Enough of this legal nonsense. We're here for her." "Stand aside, no," Caleb said. The word was not a shout, it was a statement of fact, as unmovable as the mountains behind him. Elara found her own voice then, clear and ringing with a conviction she hadn't known she possessed. "I will not go with you," she said, looking directly at Blackwood. "You are a liar and a cheat, and I will not be bullied by you any longer." It was a pivotal moment. She was no longer hiding behind Caleb's strength, she was standing with him, their resolve a single, united front. They were a wall, and Blackwood and his hired lawman were about to discover just how solid that wall was. The standoff on the porch crackled with tension. Sheriff Miller, flustered by Caleb's calm defiance and unaccustomed to being questioned, puffed out his chest. "Thorne, you are obstructing justice. I can arrest you for that." Caleb didn't even flinch. His eyes, cold as a winter river, remained locked on Sterling Blackwood. It was Blackwood who was the true threat, the sheriff was merely a pawn. Seeing his legal authority questioned and his intimidation tactics failing, Blackwood's mask of civility finally crumbled completely, revealing the raw, petulant entitlement beneath. With a snarl of frustration, he shoved the sheriff aside. "I've had enough of this," he spat, his eyes wild with fury. He took a lunging step toward the doorway, his hand reaching for Elara's arm. "You are coming with me, now." In the space of a heartbeat, Caleb moved. It was not the clumsy charge of an angry brute, but a movement of startling, fluid grace. He didn't strike Blackwood. He didn't need to. He simply interposed his body, shielding Elara completely, and his hand shot out, clamping around Blackwood's wrist. The grip was like iron. Blackwood cried out, a sharp gasp of pain and shock, his forward momentum halted as if he had run into a stone wall. All the air seemed to leave the porch. Caleb leaned in close, his voice no longer a rumble but a low, dangerous growl that promised controlled violence. You will not touch her. The sheer, condensed power in those 5 words, the culmination of years of silent grief and burgeoning protectiveness, was more terrifying than any physical blow. It stunned Blackwood into submission and made Sheriff Miller take an involuntary step back. At that precise, dramatic moment, the sound of another horse approaching at a steady canter cut through the tense silence. A lone rider appeared, a tall, stern-faced man in a dusty but respectable coat. He dismounted with an air of quiet authority. It was Judge Abernathy, the circuit judge, a man renowned throughout the territory for his unbending integrity. His sharp eyes took in the entire scene in an instant, the terrified look on Blackwood's face, Caleb's iron grip on his wrist, the flimsy warrant still clutched in the sheriff's hand, and Elara, standing resolute behind her protector. The judge's gaze settled on the sheriff. "Miller," he said, his voice sharp with disapproval. "What is the meaning of this?" The arrival of Judge Abernathy shifted the balance of power irrevocably. Caleb released Blackwood's wrist, stepping back to stand beside Elara once more. Blackwood cradled his arm, his face a mixture of pain and panicked fury. The judge's presence was a force that a corrupt sheriff and a wealthy schemer could not overcome. "I asked you a question, Sheriff," the judge repeated, his voice like chipping stone. Sheriff Miller, sweating profusely under the judge's piercing gaze, began to stammer about his duty and the warrant. Judge Abernathy took the document from him, glanced at it with disdain, and then turned his full attention to Sterling Blackwood. "Mr. Blackwood, is it? I was in the next county over when I received a message from Mr. Thorne. He suggested there might be a legal matter here requiring my oversight. Please, enlighten me as to the nature of your claim against this woman." Under the weight of the judge's scrutiny, Blackwood's story, which had sounded so convincing when whispered as rumor, quickly unraveled. His accusations were vague, his evidence non-existent. Elara, at the judge's prompting, spoke her truth. She told her story again, not with the tremor of a victim, but with the clear, steady voice of a survivor. She detailed the forged documents, the embezzled funds, the character assassination. Judge Abernathy, a man who had seen every form of human deceit, listened intently. He cross-examined Blackwood, whose answers became increasingly defensive and contradictory. The entire sordid affair was laid bare on the porch of the Thorne Ranch. In the end, Judge Abernathy rendered his verdict without a courtroom. He declared the warrant invalid and sternly warned Sheriff Miller about the consequences of abusing his office. Then he turned to Blackwood, his expression one of utter contempt. "You, sir, are a disgrace. You have used lies to ruin a good family and to harass an innocent woman. I suggest you leave this territory at once. Should I hear of you causing any more trouble for Miss Vance, I will personally see to it that a thorough investigation is opened into your own business affairs." The threat was clear. Defeated and exposed, Sterling Blackwood cast one last look of pure hatred at Elara and Caleb before mounting his horse and riding away, his sham authority vanishing like smoke in the wind. The threat was gone. The quiet returned to the ranch, but it was a new kind of quiet. It was not the sound of loneliness, but the sound of peace. It was the sound of a home, safe and secure. In the weeks that followed the confrontation, a profound change settled over the Thorne Ranch. The shadow of the past had been banished, not by forgetting, but by facing it together. The work continued, but its rhythm was different now, punctuated by shared glances, soft-spoken words, and the comfortable presence of two people who had found solace in one another. Caleb finished the barn. On the day he hammered the final board into place, he stood back and looked at the magnificent structure. It was no longer a monument to his guilt, a penance for a life he couldn't save. It was a symbol of the future, a testament to the act of rebuilding. Elara came and stood beside him, her hand finding his. It felt as natural as breathing. He looked from the barn to her, his stormy eyes clear for the first time she could remember. "This place," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "it was just land and lumber. A place to bury myself. You made it a home again." A gentle smile touched her lips. She looked at the thriving garden she had nurtured from the dead earth, its vibrant greens and blossoming colors a mirror of the life she felt blooming within her own heart. She squeezed his hand. "We made it a home, Caleb." The walls around his heart, built stone by silent stone, had finally crumbled. He had let someone in, and instead of the pain he had feared, he had found healing. Her resilience had not just allowed her to survive, it had given him the strength to live again. They had found love not by erasing their scars, but by recognizing them as part of the journey that had led them to each other. Their bond was not one of passionate fire, but of the quiet, steady warmth of an ember that had been protected from the storm and carefully nurtured back into a gentle, enduring flame. They were two solitary souls who had discovered that together they were no longer alone. They were whole. 2 years later, the Thorn Ranch was a portrait of life renewed. The house, once a hollow shell, was filled with light and the faint, sweet scent of baking bread. The windows, once vacant, now looked out upon fields of healthy cattle and a landscape that seemed less lonely, more welcoming. Ilara and Caleb were married, their union celebrated not with a grand affair, but with a quiet ceremony on the porch, with Judge Abernathy as their witness. Caleb was a changed man. The heavy silence had lifted, replaced by a thoughtful quiet and the occasional low chuckle that was, to Ilara, the most beautiful sound in the world. The stoic protector now had a peace that radiated from him, a contentment that had settled deep into his soul. Ilara's gentle strength had blossomed into a serene and profound joy. She moved about her home with a grace that spoke of belonging, of having finally found her safe harbor. One evening, they sat together on the porch swing Caleb had built, watching the sun paint the sky in hues of orange and rose. The silence between them was a warm blanket. A small giggle broke the quiet, and a dark-haired little boy with his father's stormy eyes and his mother's bright smile toddled out of the house and ran unsteadily into Caleb's outstretched arms. Caleb lifted his son, holding him close, his face transformed by a love so fierce and tender it seemed to illuminate him from within. He looked at Ilara over the child's head, his eyes conveying everything his words sometimes could not. She smiled back, her heart overflowing. Here, on this land that had once been a refuge for grief, they had cultivated a family. They had proven that even in the most barren soil, after the most devastating fire, life and love could not only return, but flourish, stronger and more beautiful than ever before.